Welcome to another episode of Peak YouTube. On the 9th of December 1982, the film industry was changed forever as Spielberg's E.T. was released. It follows the story of an extraterrestrial getting lost on Earth and being taken into care by a human boy named Elliot. Welcoming E.T. into his home, Elliot introduces him to his brother and sister who keep his existence a secret. However, E.T. falls ill and this leads to government intervention and a dire situation for Elliot. The movie explodes into theaters, making $972 million in the box office, or about $2 billion in today's money. But the box office wasn't their only way of making money. Plenty of merchandise was produced, and one of those just happened to be E.T. on the Atari 2600. The Atari 2600 is the first console that more than 4 people owned. While most of the competition were Pong machines, this was a Pong machine that you could switch out games, then play Pong again because the rest of the games were arse. It was released in 1977 when video games were just starting up and getting a rise in popularity. The console had a maximum output of 160 by 192 pixels and could display 128 colours. The controller features a large joystick with a single button. While the design and graphics have definitely aged, even in its time, a lot of the games were mediocre. We wanted Space Invaders, but we got Space Invaders at home. People paid $1,000 for this. A lot of this mediocrity came from the fact that it was discovered that if people make Atari cartridges, as long as the code on the cartridge wasn't the same as Atari's, then it was perfectly legal for them to sell. This caused dozens upon dozens of nobody developers you've never heard of to produce hundreds of monotonous, boring titles and bloated the market with so many of these. It made the video game industry go from around $3 billion to around $100 million in valuation. During this time, there were also a few video game hits, like the Atari port of Pac-Man or Raiders. Atari had found their formula: get a big license and make games based on them. It didn't even matter if they were good, just as long as they were finished on time and showed resemblance to the source material. Spider-Man was one of these that seemed kind of fun. You use your webs to climb up towers avoiding obstacles, or the Donkey Kong port, which is actually quite good, though it did get washed by the future NES port of the game. But one of these licensed games stood out the most, and that was Raiders of the Lost Ark. The video game adaptation of the classic film was an absolute hit on the Atari. For the time, it was an immersive, expansive adventure experience that really made you feel like Indiana Jones. The trees were lifelike, the graphics were mind-blowing. I said for the time. The game was made and developed by a man named Scott Warshaw. Born in Colorado and graduated with a master's degree in computer engineering, he was hired as a game programmer and designer for Atari, his first hit being Yar's Revenge. To be honest, I've never heard of it either, but apparently it was really good. He put a lot of thought and effort into his games, like when he bought a bullwhip to get into the character of Indiana Jones. While he was taking breaks, he would crack his whip to scare his co-workers. This work ethic and just the genuine talent this man had for game design meant that if anyone was to handle big licenses, he was the man. So who better than him to control the production of what was pitched to Warshaw as the most important game to ever be made. The upcoming movie E.T. was noticed by Atari before a lot of other companies for merchandising, so they instantly got to work to make something for the Atari using this IP. In fact, Spielberg himself said he wanted Warshaw to make this game after seeing his work on Raiders. So if the director of this movie wanted this man to make it, the man made a smash hit himself, and it's the biggest license Atari has been able to use, then it's bound to be an incredible journey in which a lost alien was... They told him to make it in 5 weeks. To allow time to produce cartridges, they asked Warshaw to make the entire game in 5 weeks. And to put that into perspective, Raiders took 9 months to produce. So to design and program the most important game in history in 5 weeks, it would have to be a feat. Warshaw said that when he accepted the offer, he had something. He didn't know what it was, but he was overflowing with it. The legend soon realized the thing he was overflowing with was stupidity. This dumbass thought it would be a great idea to try producing something as important as Shakespeare's birth in the same amount of time it took me to release this video. The development of this game completely took over his life. In 2 days, he had to make a pitch of the design to the director of the movie himself. Imagine putting deep thought for 2 entire days trying to decide how to make the most important video game created, just for some old movie director to say, well, couldn't it be more like Pac-Man? No, you absolute idiot. You see, this is my design and my version is more accurate to the movie. This is not an adaptation of Pac-Man the movie. By that I mean, this is the only design that could be made in 5 weeks, please accept it or I may lose my sanity and or custody of my children. So it was settled, Washoe would begin development of his version of the game. He would begin, but he would not stop. All day, every day he was coding. Even away from his computer he would be coding in his head. In fact, he almost got into a car accident because he was coding in his head. You know, like any normal person. So if I'm right, like I must equal. He got a development kit in his home, so he would never be more than 2 minutes away from working on his video game. All day, every day, this man worked his ass off. But there was still one more thing he needed to do: present the game to Spielberg himself. As Spielberg played through the game, Washoe nervously watched as the main man fell to obstacles countless times. When it was all done, Spielberg said, "I love it." I don't know if Spielberg was a bit sleepy or he was on something. Like, in my opinion, the Pac-Man clone would have been better. Some theories say Spielberg was held at gunpoint or even beaten with a crowbar before this statement. Therefore, he may have not been fully conscious or even said it at all. Because who looks at this and thinks, huh, fun? The game can't have been that bad, right? The creator had limited time, so instead of creating a long title, he made some set screens that are randomly ordered each time you play to give each player a difference and add longevity to the game, as it takes only on average about 15 minutes to beat. You play as E.T. and wander through many rooms in which you have to not fall into large pits. However, you will fall into these pits. Over, and over, and over again. And when you fall into these pits, you will use your alien powers to float out. That's the entire game. You do this until you reach the end. With such a primitive concept of a game, you can see why it received such horrible reviews and reception. People called it tedious, repetitive, and punishing. The media was furious. Such a beloved movie's video game adaptation was executed so poorly, which at the time wasn't expected seeing as it was made by the same person who made Raiders. However, it wasn't just E.T. that was disappointing, the entire video game industry was. Games were diminishing in quality with an inflation of games in the market, and as any and every developer was filling the market with horrible, poor quality titles. This made people think that it was the games themselves that were the problem, and that games were just a phase that would eventually die out. The mass unappeal of video games was only heightened by the absolute dumpster fire of the game that was E.T. While yes, there were plenty of more confusing, worse looking and less fun games on the market, the fact that this game was the time's biggest intellectual property, made by the most talented developer and on the most popular console, made people think it had to be games as a medium that were bad. Slowly but surely, a massive market crash in video games caused sales to plummet even more until they had so many copies they genuinely couldn't sell. So they could A. Sell them all cheaper, B. Give them away for free, or C. Fucking bury them. They chose option C. However, this was actually a myth for around 30 years. An urban legend that some thought was true and some thought otherwise was the story of how, out of embarrassment, Atari just burned thousands of remaining copies of E.T. The story had been floating around for almost 30 years until in 2014 when a group of passionate fans making a documentary on the myth went to explore for themselves. Zach Penn, the guy who wrote The Incredible Hulk and The Avengers, directed a brilliant documentary called Atari Game Over. He and his team had one day to excavate the fabled location in which E.T. was said to be buried. Alamogordo, New Mexico. No, not Albuquerque, New Mexico. A small town and seemingly random place to put these. Of all places, why here? Well, after Atari had just lost $300 million the previous year, they decided to make some business changes. Atari was moving production over to Taiwan, but the original production site still had plenty of games, parts and hardware that was unsold, so they thought to just throw everything into a pit. However, to avoid people losing the junkyard, they decided it would be best to dump it in Alamogordo, New Mexico, as they had laws and protection against looting junkyards. However, if somebody told me that a perfectly fine NES was buried in an unguarded place, but it was illegal to take, then unfortunately I'm breaking the law. And that's what a lot of people did. So Atari then placed security around the site to fend off any children trying to get some free Atari games. They later put cement over it, and in total an estimated 700,000 games were buried. Fast forward to 2014, over the course of 6 months the team would be creating and producing the documentary until the fateful day came. They had permission to excavate and dig in the landfill for 1 day. After 3 hours of digging, 20 feet underground, there it was. Hundreds of items of Atari merchandise, including copies of E.T., were found. 1,300 of the games were unearthed. Some were auctioned, some were kept by the documentary makers, and some were given to the local museum. It may have taken 31 years, but the worst game created the greatest legend.